Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining today's session as part of the Lefty Lunchtime series at Arise 2022, an online festival of left ideas. Before we go ahead, I'd like to encourage you to all book your festival tickets for the rest of the month, which provides the funding necessary to keep these events going, and you can really get involved with the month-long program. The link to do so should be in the chat box. I'm Adrian Weir. I'm the Chulo officer at Hornsey and Wood Green CLP in London and a member of Labour's National Policy Forum, and I'm currently seeking re-election to that body from the London region. I'll be chairing this lunchtime session. Today's event is entitled "Only a Fundamental Power Shift Can End the Cost of Living Crisis," and is exactly the issue we need to be discussing as the Conservatives go into a leadership contest and the Labour leadership is increasingly asked where its policies are. We meet during an unprecedented strike wave, certainly in recent times, and it seems that the pandemic has changed the game. Before coronavirus, strike days were at an historic low, even though pay as a share of GDP was declining all through the neoliberal period from 1980. If our share of the national cake had been getting smaller, then that part going to profit and dividends has, of course, been growing. For 12 years under this Conservative government, despite the financial crisis, the incomes of those at the top, especially those in private finance, has soared, whilst pay has been held down for millions. The rich are indeed getting richer. This has not been an accident, of course. The whole point of neoliberalism is so that the elites can claw back that which was taken from them in the years of social democratic advance after the Second World War. What we now see is a resurgent militancy as workers seek to recoup pandemic losses or keep up with price rises. There is, I think it's clearly demonstrated, there's no such thing as a wage price spiral, because with RPI on about 10 or 11%, wage increases are about a quarter of that. The response from this dying Conservative government was only yesterday to introduce new regulations that allow agency workers to replace those taking industrial action. But industrial action is back with a bang, and it's necessary to mobilize a new generation of activists in engaging with it, understanding it, and being prepared to lead it. At the same time, we also need to put forward an alternative economic strategy that can restructure and rebalance the economy, transforming the economy so it serves the public good and not corporate greed. This means extending public ownership, a socialist Green New Deal, real action on equality, full employment, trade union rights, and much more besides. We couldn't have a better lineup today to discuss the alternative to the cost of living crisis, which is deepening every day, both here and indeed around the world. Our speakers today are Andrew Fisher, former Labour Party Executive Director of Policy, and Özlem Onaran, Professor of Economics at the University of Greenwich. And once they've made their contributions, can I ask if people have questions, you can put them in the chat on YouTube. Both our speakers will introduce the topic for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. So firstly, can I ask Andrew for his contribution?
Thanks, Adrian, for that introduction. I think it's important to understand where we are economically. The threat, as Adrian said, isn't a wage price spiral. One, that's not happening. And two, it's not a threat, even if the government and employers gave in to union demands for what is possibly the most modest set of demands the unions have come out with, just keep our pay level with inflation. That's uncontroversial when inflation's at 2 or 3%. It should be uncontroversial when inflation's at 10%. People need to keep up with the cost of living. But we do face an economic threat, and that threat is recession. And I want to explain why that is. We've got falling real wages, as Adrian alluded to in the introduction there. Inflation's at 10 or 11%. Wage rises are at 3 or 4%. And so there's a real squeeze on household disposable incomes. The Treasury forecasts are that squeeze will be worse than the OBR predicted even just back in March at the time of the last budget. And we're seeing the consequences of that. Just today, new figures out from the British Retail Consortium and KPMG show that retail sales fell again. So we're buying less in the shops in the past month. And that follows declines in April and in May. So there's a real threat here of recession. June is usually a month historically where sales spike because people have more parties, more barbecues, they buy more food, they socialize more, they go to weddings, they prepare for their holidays. And so that hasn't happened. Sales have declined after 2 months of decline. So this is quite a big backward step for the economy. And there's a reason for that. People haven't got money in their pockets. We've got unsustainable levels of personal debt, which are rising. Research by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation finds that low-income households report owing £22 billion in debt, and 12.5 billion of that has been taken on just in the first 6 months of this year. So we're on the brink of recession, and there's a very real risk with that we start adding job losses to the misery as well. Because if you start, if retailers are selling less, if hospitality and leisure are doing less trade, then they will start laying people off. And that is because people haven't got enough to spend. So the way to revive this is to put more money in people's pockets. And whenever there's a cost of living crisis, and the government and people tell you there's a cost of living crisis, the real question, the most pertinent question to ask is, well, who pays for that? Because at the moment we've seen, and Unite's research shows this, huge levels of profiteering from the corporate sector. So the money is there. And I think we have to ask ourselves almost a prior question, a bigger question even than that, which is, why does this keep happening? We had the banking crash in 2007-8, and we've had virtually stagnant economic growth, stagnant wage growth, stagnant productivity growth since then. We haven't found a solution to this, and there's a reason for that. The cost of basics have gone up. Things like housing, whether you rent or you've got a mortgage, house prices are ridiculous, rental costs are ridiculous. Jobs and pay, jobs are increasingly insecure. People can't get the hours they need, and pay has gone down in real terms. We are forecast by the OBR to be earning no more in 2025 than we were in 2008, which is against all historical trends, the longest squeeze on living standards and incomes on record. You've got an increasing cohort of pensioners coming into retirement now without decent pensions, without final salary pensions, without defined benefit pensions as well. You've got more people living with student debt, which takes a huge chunk out of their potential disposable income because they're paying an extra 9% in tax over and above the threshold. And we're seeing profiteering from the privatised utilities, which has been going on since Thatcher era privatisation. Now, what are the solutions to this? I think they're 3 or 4-fold. Let me just run through a few very briefly. Public ownership. I mean, we saw just this week, EDF has been fully nationalised. But before that, EDF was 85% owned by the state, and they capped price rises at 4% in France. Now, that's in a wild difference to the energy prices here, which will have doubled over the course of the last year and more by the time we get to January next year. In terms of wages, if we look at the year I was born, just to be a bit self-referential about this, in 1979, there were twice as many trade union members as there are now, and 4/5 of workers had their pay negotiated collectively as part of a union agreement with their employer. Today, it's about 1/5 of workers have that, and only 6.5 million, roughly, are trade union members, and it's much harder to take strike action, much harder to both gain and maintain decent wages. Tony Blair, for instance, boasted in 1998 that his government would leave British law the most restrictive on trade unions in the Western world. We need more redistributive taxation. We need to tax the rich more. That's where the money is, after all. There's no point putting up taxes on poor people. In reality, the tax burden, we see this kind of cavalcade of clowns at the moment competing to be the Tory, next Tory leader, saying we're going to slash taxes, we're going to slash taxes. You're not unless you are going to hollow out public services. We have an aging population. That means more demands on pensions, on the NHS, on social care. The tax burden is going to rise. Live with it. Would be my advice to the Tories. You need to accept it. The demands of climate change we need to transform our economy. That's going to have a cost, certainly in the interim. Savings in the long term, perhaps. And Britain's economic underperformance for the past at least 15 years now requires long-term investment and restructuring. The other thing I think we need to look at in the immediate period is price controls. You look at what Germany's done in terms of reducing fares. I think there's a €9 ticket, monthly ticket for transport. Now that's astonishingly cheap. You can barely get 10 miles on the railways for €9, or the equivalent of €9. We need to control rents, as they do in cities across the globe, as Sadiq Khan has called for in London, to have rent controls. And we need more council housing so that we're not using our social security system to put money into the pockets of private landlords so that people can live in often substandard housing at huge expense. This is a completely false economy, and that's what happens with privatization. And finally, if whoever wins the Tory leadership, and God help us all, whoever it is, they're talking about slashing taxes to unleash a new wave of austerity. I don't think many people are going to look at this current situation and think, well, there's a cost of living crisis. The best thing to do is give 30 billion to profit-making corporations. But that's what they seem intent on doing. And that's a path to recession more than anything else. Further restricting trade union rights. We saw that earlier this week, as Adrian referred to, and I wrote in the iPaper on this week. But out of this crisis, I think, is an opportunity for the left, for the trade unions, as people like Mick Lynch, who was, became a household name last month with the rail strikes, and the Labour Party, to be building the argument for that redistribution in power and wealth. And if we don't do it, and if we keep framing it as tax cuts are the magic money tree, then we're not going to win the argument. And there's a real lesson here for the Labour Party to wake up and start making those arguments. And I'll leave it there, because I think that's been about 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks very much, Andrew. Very interesting. And we'll go straight over to Özlem, and 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thanks to Arise Festival for the invitation. It's great to be back with Arise, and it's also a great pleasure for me to share the platform with Adrian and Andrew Fisher, whose work I have admired for the things he has done for the manifestos under Jeremy's leadership. I want to put all this discussion in the context of the broader multiple crises we are going through. It's really a critical junction with rising inequalities, ecological breakdown, cost of living, and on top of that, now Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And as the prices of energy, food, other essentials continue to soar across the world, threatening famine in parts of the world, in the Middle East or Africa, we are going through the care and ecological crises and inequalities in all dimensions with respect to class, race, gender, and across countries. Now, before we start talking about today's cost of living crisis, we have to remind ourselves that this squeeze in workers' income and the rise in the profit share is not new. Wages fell after the Great Recession, and the years of austerity by the Condem government deepened the attack on wages. And ever since, nominal wages have been failing to catch up with the rise in prices year after year. So the real wage of many workers, that is after adjusting for the rise in prices, are still lower than what they were before 2007. And this is coming on top of decades of undervalued wages for essential workers in the care economy and public services, and squeeze in wages by an unleashed capital thanks to neoliberal globalization, financialization, and attack on trade unions. So today's cost of living crisis isn't new, but of course its current scale is the deepest in a generation. And now on top of all these, we have the new problems of supply chain disruptions after Brexit, after the pandemic, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, hitting food and energy prices, which constitute a very large share of the essential consumption of working class households. And in the meantime, profits and the wealth of the super rich at the top 1% of the distribution have recovered from the crisis, keep increasing. So let's get things right at this critical juncture. Today's inflation is an outcome of conflicting claims over the distribution of income. Currently, the profit share of the capitalists are being protected, while workers' share is being squeezed by the increase in the cost of imported energy and other imported inputs. Bank of England's governor says workers have to pay for this crisis by capping their wage demands. But we should say it doesn't have to be like this, particularly after a decade of squeezing wages, or more than decades of squeezing wages. We could also say the super rich have to pay for this crisis. And again, in terms of building on our confidence about getting things right, the current response to this crisis by the Bank of England to increase the interest rate will just give more money to the wealthy who already own assets. The current mandate of Bank of England targeting very narrowly inflation and as low as possible inflation has a major problem for us. It always comes at the cost to workers, either as recession and high unemployment or bad quality jobs, as we have in Britain, 0 hours contracts labeled as labor market flexibility. This mandate, this policy stance only helps the rentier who make profits by speculation and lending. And actually, inflation being as low as possible is good for the rentier, but high unemployment or bad quality jobs that comes with such policies are bad for workers. So what can be our alternatives? And I want to distinguish between short run and medium run here. In the short run, well, first join a trade union. Let's rebuild our trade unions. Let's join the fight against low wages. Along with it, let's fight to increase the minimum wage to £15 per hour. Let's fight to increase public sector pay beyond inflation to recover the losses of the past decade since 2008. Let's, of course, increase benefits by tying them to the rate of increase in retail price index. And let's fight overall in the economy, also in the private sector, to increase wages along with inflation and along with the past increases in productivity. That's not enough. We want to arrest inflation. The way to fight it in the short run in wartime economics has always been price controls. Andrew has said that. Let's control the price of energy. Let's bring back a decent cap on energy prices. If that leads to the bankruptcy of some private providers, so be it. Let's nationalize any failing gas suppliers in the short run immediately. Let's control rents, and the third price to control is the price of a basket of essential food items. Along with that, we need to, in the short run, get serious about household debt and restructure household debt, particularly linking payments to income. And we should talk about global justice and famine and food crisis in the low and middle income countries by debt restructuring and debt cancellation. So what can we do in the medium run? I'm going to start with the monetary policy, Bank of England. If raising interest rates is bad economics, what should they do? They should target full employment along with inflation, not just narrowly inflation. They have to have a dual mandate with a higher weight on the employment target and a reasonably high inflation target consistent with this full employment target. By inflation target, I don't mean 10%, but I would rather see an inflation target of around 5% that would be consistent with full employment, foreseeable, not leaving things to uncertainty. So this is very different from targeting as low as possible inflation at the risk of recession that only serves the rich and the rentier. In this alternative mandate, the monetary policy of the Bank of England should accommodate an expansionary fiscal policy as part of a broad macroeconomic policy framework. That has to be, of course, accompanied by labor market institutions, ensuring that workers can continue to negotiate for wage increases in line with this targeted inflation rate of the Bank of England. And when I say full employment, I mean full employment with decent jobs and decent wages, not lousy jobs. So that brings me to the public spending fiscal policy dimension of things, targeting what I call a green, purple, red New Deal, with a target to tackle those multiple crises, the ecological crisis, energy crisis, food crisis, care crisis, and multiple inequalities. At the core of that is a massive mobilization of public investment, particularly targeting green physical infrastructure in renewable energy. With that, I mean wind, solar, geothermal, and hydro, not biofuel, not nuclear energy. The second dimension of those green public investments is energy efficiency investments, including insulation. The third dimension is public transport, to green our transport, to shift from personal vehicles towards public transport. In terms of other infrastructure investment, we should prioritize green social housing investment. And last but not least, we have to address the care deficit by a massive mobilization of spending in the care economy, what we call the purple social infrastructure, to provide free universal basic services in education, childcare, health, and social care. Of course, that brings me then to my next point. If we will be mobilizing that public investment, how will we continue to provision of these? Just as in the case of the care economy and the universal basic services of the social infrastructure, I advocate publicly owned utility companies in energy, publicly owned public transport, providing basically free public transport and affordable energy. When I talk about public ownership of these key industries, I have a broad understanding of that. It ranges from central government ownership to local authority or cooperatives, depending on the nature of the industry or the services. And of course, it's very important that all that is done within the context of a democratic, participatory, planned economy, covering the key sectors in terms of public ownership, but creating mechanisms of collective voice for the people who produces these services, as well as for the communities who use these services. And my last point, is that unaffordable? Is that unfeasible? Quite on the contrary, that is totally within our reach. This is why I'm using the term medium run. That's not a long-term dream. It is a medium-run thing that a Labour government can afford to do within the context of one term of a government. The good thing about public investment is it will partly finance itself. But let's be honest, of course, we will need to use all the tools in our toolkit, starting with, of course, progressive taxation of not just income, but also wealth, particularly targeting a new progressive wealth tax targeting the super rich at the top 1% of the distribution. It's much broader than the current one-off windfall tax that the Labour leadership has proposed. and the government has currently picked up. It covers all the wealth, from business wealth to financial wealth to real estate, owned by the particularly top 1% of the richest households in Britain. Of course, we have other kits in our toolkit that's about using the monetary policy to accommodate fiscal policies, direct financing of public investment, as well as financing of a national investment bank that can use monetary expansion by the Bank of England, as well as borrow itself in the private credit markets to fund such green and purple public investment projects. Public borrowing in the very short run is part of our toolkit as well. Particularly, it takes time to prevent tax evasion, prevent tax avoidance, build the institutions. And in that very short run, it's perfectly legitimate to borrow by a government to fund a massive urgent mobilization of public investment to green and purple our economy. Mind you, these are things that will also help to address the cost of living crisis, because it will provide clean, renewable energy, as well as insulate our homes, make our public services, as well as industrial production, a lot more energy efficient. And in between, it will provide public transport, in my opinion, universally and free of charge. There's one more key sector that this recent cost of living crisis, I think, is making very visible to us. What do we do in the sector of the production and distribution of food? In my opinion, that's another key area for public investment to foster sustainable organic agriculture to produce plant-based food against the domination of the market by food billionaires and financial speculators. Again, when I use the term public investment here, I'm using it broadly to cover cooperatives and collective production supported by the government initiatives. And last but not least, if we want to talk really about a list of sectors that we want under public ownership, we should add that the financial industry, we need large public banks facilitating such a program, working with a national investment bank. We need, of course, cooperative banks that channel local investments towards socially useful cooperative projects. But to recap all that will work if we have a democratic participatory planned economy based on a massive mobilization of public investment. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your discussions around this.
Okay, thank you very much. And we're already getting questions coming in from our audience on Facebook and YouTube. I'm going to take this one because it's. I'll take this one first because it relates to a point that you just made in closing. I think about the financial institutions, and our question is from MD Genjin on YouTube, who says, "Can we please take the banks into public ownership?" And he's got a supplementary, but we can perhaps deal with that one first, Andrew and Özlem.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the banks should have been taken into public ownership following the crash in 2007. We had a huge opportunity to do it. And in fact, what we did was bail them out, leave them in private ownership. And, we didn't make the most of the opportunity to restructure the economy, restructure the way the banking sector worked. We had the absurdity at one point, and I forget which individual bank it was, of having nationalized one effectively in order to stabilize it. And it still had an advisory unit that was advising wealthy clients how to dodge their taxes when it was publicly owned by the state that needed those taxes, and had just used those taxes to bail out the bank so it still existed. So it was a completely missed opportunity then. And I think there were a number of figures on the Labour left, in fact, one of whom went on to be Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, who was calling for the banks to be taken into public ownership at that time. But yeah, that was a huge missed opportunity, and we should have used it then. What I think is interesting now is since then we've looked at sort of how to sort of use finance in a public way. So we've talked about a national infrastructure bank, national investment banks, regional development banks in order to restructure the economy. And actually some of that agenda got taken up by Rishi Sunak, whether it survives this Tory party contest where they're drifting further and further to the right and away from a kind of one nation conservatism, who knows, but it'll be interesting to see. But yeah, huge missed opportunity in 2007. That was the time to have done it, to nationalize, to transform, not to nationalize, to stabilize the private sector.
Okay. Özlem?
Yeah, sadly, we may end up arriving another opportunity in terms of nationalizing the banking sector, because these crises are not going to go away. Household debt, indebted firms sadly will face insolvencies and bankruptcies. Some banks will face difficulties. So certainly now we have to learn the lessons that any support to prevent a bankruptcy of a systemic large bank has to come with taking over the control of that bank, and any support to any firm in general really has to come with conditionalities. Having said that, without looking forward to this happening, because it's never a good thing to arrive at that financial crash moment for the working people either, we have to, in the meantime, propose to a new Labour government to grow our own in terms of building large public banks, specializing in funding in the key areas from supporting agriculture to supporting green infrastructure to the care economy. We should find ways of nurturing cooperative local savings banks, collectively owned. And in my opinion, this is a means of suffocating the socially useless, exploitative private banking system until we get to the point that we can really talk about a change in balance of power relations, where we can really talk about nationalizing the private banking system. Obviously, that suffocation of private banking system also includes a very different attitude towards regulating the banking system. Certainly that would require capital controls, and they will set, I think, the rules of the game in such a different way that City of London will stop being attractive for multinational banking, and it will be an attractive place for publicly owned banking. It is a difficult transition, and I want to emphasize that nationalization would have been done a lot more easily when you're anyway bailing out the private banking system. And I'm not hoping for another banking crisis as an opportunity to do that. But when and if that happens, obviously the opportunity can't be missed by a Labour government. And to any government, we should certainly mobilize to push for such an attitude.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another question, picking up a theme you just referred to, Andrew, about Rishi Sunak. And the question is, what are the differences in terms of economic policy in addressing the cost of living crisis between Rishi Sunak and the more tax cuts now candidates that have so far declared?
Well, I'm not going to give a party political broadcast for Rishi Sunak, but yeah, I think what's interesting about this Conservative election contest so far is that there's clearly a backlash by the very right wing of the Conservative Party, which seems to be the dominant faction at the moment, certainly in terms of setting the agenda, at least anyway, for tax cuts, and not tax cuts on things like VAT, which are regressive taxes, not tax cuts on council tax, which again is another regressive tax that has gone up above inflation in recent years. But on taxes to corporations or the very rich. That's where they want to cut taxes. And you've seen that already, actually. Rishi Sunak in the last budget cut the banking levy on banks from, I think, 8%, 7 or 8% down to 3%. He raised corporation tax, or scheduled corporation tax rises. We should remember they haven't actually kicked in yet, from 19 up to 25%, but that was offset by 25 billion in tax reliefs over the following 2 years, so that money was more than recouped straight away. So I don't think we should have any great faith that Rishi Sunak is going to be a kind of more progressive option than any of the other Tory candidates, but he'd be more subtle about it. And I think, I suspect whoever becomes Tory leader, unless they want to throw away the next election, and it seems like they are stupid enough to do so, some of them, I don't think he'll put that front and centre. I think he said something along the lines of, yes, I want to cut taxes in the long run, but not in the middle of a cost of living crisis, which at least hints at a kind of sensibility, at least a tactical awareness that, perhaps giving away 30 billion to corporations when people are going to food banks in increasing numbers perhaps isn't the priority of the British public if you want to win an election. So we'll see how that goes down with the Tory selectorate, both their MPs and then subsequently their members. It will certainly be an interesting watch, but at the moment they're giving Labour all the opportunities to put a counter argument very strongly. I just hope they start taking it soon.
Yeah, indeed, yeah. Özlem.
Maybe just to add to Andrew's very good points, obviously Rishi Sunak's plan is to postpone cutting the taxes until the new election campaign kicks in. So that will be his election ticket. I think at this point, it's very important for us to say all the public sector workers' pay rise demands, from the doctors to bus drivers, to rail workers, to teachers, are affordable. In the sense that it doesn't lead to something that will increase the cost of production of private sectors. It's public spending. If you pay to the nurses, social care workers, doctors, teachers, it will be paid by the government. The government shouldn't cut taxes today, and also shouldn't cut the taxes in the future as an election sweetener to their constituencies. And there's all the money to pay for all the pay rise demanded by, including NHS staff. If you have noticed, they're asking for covering all the losses that they have incurred in the past decade. That's about 30%. It may strike you as impossible, but actually the government can pay it if they don't cut taxes, and maybe if they increase taxes on the top of percent, as we are saying. So it's actually a very important, simple point to make. And that won't even change inflation rate, because a doctor's or a nurse's or a teacher's pay is not an input for the private sector's production.
Yeah, indeed. I read this morning that some of these candidates are proposing tax cuts that are so huge they amount to the entire NHS budget, which is just absolute fantasy world. Okay, we have another question from Alexander on YouTube. He says, clearly we can't rely on this government to make significant changes, and our speakers this afternoon have posed many alternative policies as our goals in this struggle. But he goes on to ask, shouldn't we make the repeal of the anti-union laws an essential part of our campaigning work?
Well, that's number one in my green, purple, red New Deal, collective voiced workers. Obviously, with the current Trade Union Act, we can just barely go on strike. I mean, I've been involved in trying to get the vote out for ballots in the higher education strikes in the past years. It exhausts all our energy for campaigning just to pass that threshold, and you know, that energy that you could use for mobilizing staff and campaigning more broadly, but that goes without saying. I mean, it is about also making simply the use of industrial action threat a credible option. So yes, I totally agree with that.
Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I agree with the questioner's point. I would just say this, or just add this really. One is, I think, if you look at the share of wages or the wage share as a proportion of GDP, it slipped from 65% or thereabouts in the mid 70s to about just under 50% now. So we've seen a big decline in the bargaining power of workers, in the share going to workers, and it's gone somewhere else. It's gone to profit, it's gone to shareholders, it's gone to increasingly to the top 1%. So far from this myth of a trickle-down effect, what we've had is this kind of gushing upwards, this vacuum effect where the rich have hoovered up all the gains for themselves. And that's why we have this cost of living crisis. That's why we're on the brink of recession, because the bulk of people just do not have the disposable income to keep a predominantly service-led economy going. And therefore, we are going to find ourselves in huge difficulty. And unless we have a rebalancing, these crises are going to become ever more frequent. And we're seeing them. We've barely been out of crisis really since 2007. We need to see this as the kind of collapse of neoliberalism. You know, that system has collapsed and we haven't got a viable alternative. And no politician has led us into that kind of position to do that. And a key part of that is restoring trade union rights, because the only way to gain and to maintain decent wage share is through active trade unions.
Okay, thank you very much both. And we don't have any more questions, and I think we're just about on time. I mean, I'll just make one closing remark before I ask Andrew and Özlem to make their summary remarks. I'm just reminded of what Professor Wilkinson has said, that the decline in the share of wages is causally related to the decline of the coverage of collective bargaining. They're not just correlated, they're absolutely causal. And you can go on to say that collective bargaining without a right to strike is reduced to collective begging. So, Andrew and Özlem, would you like to sum up our discussion this lunchtime? Andrew?
Well, I think there's been a huge amount of agreement, really. We haven't had much to disagree on. And I think all the points have probably been made. But what I would say is this, and this is how we transform those ideas into political action. You know, for me, I'm a Labour Party member. I've been a Labour Party member for 26 years. So that's through a lot of bad times and good. You know, I've not always been the greatest fan of the leader in that time. I've disagreed with all of them, actually. You can't be a good advisor to Jeremy or to any leader if you constantly just agree with them. But the reality is politics isn't a spectator sport. You can't just elect somebody and put your faith in them. You have to be active. And whether that's in your trade union, in a renters union, in some sort of activist group, whether that's over the climate or against austerity or for feminism or for, you know, LGBT rights, it doesn't matter what, you have to participate, you know. And I just think the most important thing, I mean, it goes back to that hoary old quote that we all use, you know, the philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. You know, you have to be active as well as thinking about this as well. So these talks are all really useful, but our job, I think, as well, is to use these kind of talks, these discussions, this exchange of ideas to bolster our own confidence in our campaigning and in our activism as well. Thanks.
Right, and Özlem.
And I'm really happy to be here with so many of you, because part of the struggle is also to debunk the myths and build confidence. And no matter if you're balloting for a strike, for a pay rise now, or you're fighting for better working conditions, all these are possible, meaningful, and we deserve it. And they are the correct economics. I have spent a lot of my time showing that the fall in the wage share is not a natural outcome of technological change or globalization. These are not unavoidable. They are totally related to the fall in the union density in this country, elsewhere in collective bargaining coverage, and therefore it's in our hands to reverse that. Another key thing to reverse that is actually public spending. Public spending in the social sector, in the care economy, and in the context of the cost of living crisis, it's about public spending in the green economy. All these things are the facilitators of decent living standards for the many, and it won't be as nice as the few are having now, because it will have to come with taxation of wealth. But I just want to maybe summarize a few of the points we have said. So today's inflation is pushed by the rise in imported input costs. It's not due to wage price spiral. It's not demand driven. To deal with it by increasing interest rates, by running a recession, is actually wrong economics, and it is also class warfare. So in the short run, we need price controls. Whoever tells you this is archaic economics is wrong. This is the only way to arrest the price increase without making the workers pay for the crisis. Give the workers a decent pay, but control the prices of key services, energy, food, and rent. And this is the only way to make the top 1%, the super rich, to pay for this. And then we should look beyond this immediate short run, change the mandate of Bank of England to target full employment and mobilize massive public spending with collective voice, with participation, and with better plan. And if you plan, price controls do not lead to shortages, but it requires, of course, planning and thinking and acting collectively.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you both. I'd like to thank you both for joining us this afternoon, this lunchtime. I thank Andrew and Özlem both very much indeed. For our audience, I'd like to remind you to book your festival tickets, which provide the funding needed to keep these events going, and to make a donation if you can at the link provided. The next Arise meeting is tomorrow evening, Wednesday, 13th of July, which at 7 p.m, and is looking at real change in Ireland, lessons for the left, with Emma Sheerin, MLA from Sinn Féin, John McDonnell MP, and Jeff Bell, the author of The Twilight of Unionism and Labour for Irish Unity. It will be chaired by Rachel Garnham from CLPD. So thanks everyone, thanks to Andrew and Özlem, thanks to our audience for joining us on YouTube, and good afternoon.